Today, we're going to be talking about upskilling employees with immersive learning. And this is a fun topic. We're going to go through just some basic introductions of who we are. We're going to talk about what we focus on upfront, which is identifying the business KPIs. Then we're going to talk about identifying the right solutions based on those KPIs. We're going to go over a few success stories, and we're going to talk about results, right? Because ultimately, if we're not doing it for the sake of hitting particular results, then why are we doing it anyway? So just as a quick introduction, my name is Steve Baer. I oversee all of the immersive learning at ELB and came over to join this company a few years ago when ELB acquired the game agency. Jordan, Steve?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Jordan Erickson, one of the founding partners of Infuse Medical. I've been at this for 17 years and I lead out new business development. Pleasure to be with you today.
Great to meet everybody. I'm Steve Deverall, also one of the founding members of Infuse. I'm our Interactive Creative Director, and I get to work with our customers coming up with fun solutions to their problems. So great to meet everybody.
Well, this is bound to be a really fun session. Just to kind of give you a sense as to what ELB and Infuse are focused on, really it's overall delivering the best learning solutions that we can, right? So what does that mean? That could mean anywhere from thinking about more immersive solutions like virtual reality or games or video practice and and coaching. It could be thinking about using the right learning management systems or the right authoring tools for rapid authoring. It could also be about building out custom solutions, and that's a lot of what we're doing. And that could be anywhere from building them out in rapid authoring like Lectora or Storyline or Captivate. Or it could be, building out in more immersive solutions using things like the training arcade or scenario VR or rehearsal or otherwise. So at the end of the day, what we're focused on is identifying the need and then based off of that need, identifying the right solution. I think that it all comes down to starting with the need. What are we trying to solve for, right? So both at ELB and Infuse, and this is something that we've been working together for the last several years and really across a variety of clients. I think both of our philosophy is let's try to understand what are we trying to solve for. And once we understand what we're solving for, then we can figure out what the right solution is, right? So I use this chart as almost an opener for some of those conversations, and I encourage you to do the same. It's not just about delivering training. It's about what problems are we trying to solve? Are we trying to create an improved learner experience, maybe more engagement, maybe sustained focus, maybe better retention? Are we trying to grow our employees? So, this is obviously, this webinar happens about reskilling or upskilling, and we're going to show examples of where you can do that. Maybe it's about improving the confidence of your learners or changing their behaviors. And ultimately, it could be about, reducing costs or reducing seat time. It could be about increasing profitability or revenue. It's most likely to be a combination of these things. And based off of that analysis, I think you're going to identify what is the right solution or solutions. When we think about solutions, they can be anywhere from very foundational, more presentational, to way more immersive, right? And today we're going to be focusing on that level 3, level 4 immersive solutions. But the reality is that when we think about our audience, our learners are spanning 5 different generations, right? So in many cases, the solutions we're delivering are going to be blended. And I don't mean blended that you start with an e-learning solution, then you move over to a augmented reality solution. It might be you need to deliver your content a few different ways at once, right? To make sure that you're hitting all of your audiences. Today, we're going to focus very much so on immersive, and we're going to go through a whole bunch of examples. So, when we think about immersive, both at ELB and at Infuse, there are a few different categories, and there's more than these, but these are 3 that stick out for both of our companies. Games and gamification, and we'll show at least one example, maybe 2 examples of that. Video practice and coaching. We're actually not going to touch upon that as much today. And 360 learning, which many refer to as virtual reality. It doesn't necessarily have to be, pure virtual reality where you're, sitting there with goggles on. You can build things out in 360 learning and use them right on desktop as well. So we're going to talk about all those things. I'm going to start by showing some examples, right? And I think we have 5 examples we're going to show today. The very first example I want to show is a project that we recently worked on with Microsoft. And this is a really exciting one, and actually one that our teams collaborated on. And what's neat about this project in particular is we use games as a way to tell a story. And that's a lot of what we focus on, right? Is telling a story that's going to help someone connect with the content, connect with characters, and think about how can they take the lessons learned and remember them in the future, right? So it's not just about being able to check off the box that I know that, but hopefully being able to recall that information when they're in the field and saying, I went through this experience and I recall there was a character just like this person that I'm talking to right now, and this is what I had to do. So let's start here and we'll come back in a sec.
Microsoft Learn Cloud Games continues to offer the most innovative ways to sharpen your technical skills while challenging you to solve high-stakes, real-world problems with our latest game, Data Feeds. Data Feeds will level up your abilities across a wide range of Microsoft technologies in a game environment that feels timely, gripping, and immersive. The CEO of your boutique biotech company summons you to his office and tasks you to solve one of the world's thorniest challenges: food waste. 40% of the food in the United States is wasted, while 10% of the world is starving. Now he wants you to use data and AI solutions to solve the problem. Your 2-hour game experience begins in the lab, taking on one of the 3 roles: a data engineer, data scientist, or data analyst. Armed with the best available food waste data on the planet, you and your teammates set out to build a data storage system, dashboard, and model. Along the way, you'll get real input and feedback from the executive team. Everything you do will be measured by the Insight Engine, which tracks your progress step by step and acts as both game board and scoreboard. You can even replay activities to refine your skills and improve your score. You'll work closely with your team to complete mini games and hands-on missions, which contribute to the ultimate goal: to finish your demo, produce a model, and export the scored data for the analyst's presentation.
Now, there's a lot more to this, and I'm going to stop it there, but there are a few themes that I think that we can all think about, whether you're building it as an immersive game like this, which happens to be, by the way, custom code, or you're building it in a rapid authoring tool. So the first thing that we're doing here, right, is that we're creating a storyline. We're creating a story for someone to be able to follow from finish to end. We're creating a challenge that we want them to be able to rise to the occasion of. What you didn't get to in this video is we're creating some sort of gotchas that are going to come up that are going to have to overcome, right? And when you and I think that's really important, because you want to make sure that they can connect with the content, they can go through a variety of activities, they can figure out how do they overcome these situations. In this example, we're doing something that is a multiplayer experience. So you're requiring people to collaborate and really think through the content together. That's also important. So, what's interesting is that this is all remote learning, but they're all collaborating through the process together. So, and then we're using components like gamification, points, badges, leaderboard status, to make sure that people are seeing the value of their progression along the way. And the really neat thing about that is you can do that in so many modalities. So I kind of put that out there for consideration about ways that you can immerse your learner into your content with stories, with hooks, with challenges, with rewards along the way for what they're doing. Okay, I'm going to keep going. We'll go to the next example, but certainly I think this theme continues as we continue. Okay, so this next example is focused on cybersecurity training. And the reason I like this example, let me just show this in full, is because, once again, this is very story-driven. Now, what you'll see is that in this example, there's a lot of tongue-in-cheek, right? We wrote this script to be a little bit more whimsical, a little more funny, and hopefully a lot more memorable as a result. There are certainly challenges along the way. There is a clear goal as to what you need to achieve, and you're learning about cybersecurity along the way through this journey.
The first in a series of immersive learning games to become cyber smart by experiencing how hackers think and act. In this game, you'll role play as an undercover operative for Hack Ops, the good guys. You'll pose as a new hacker recruit for the bad guys, a notorious hacking ring called Dark Web Go. Your mission, to learn the tricks of recent major hacks while impressing the bad guys and gaining their trust. Through the help of your faceless recruiter, Uncle Lenny, and your on-site handler, Hope, you'll journey to the depths of the dark web goat. Dive into this fully immersive virtual reality experience.
Each floor is a different level of hacker. The better you do, the further down you go. Make it through the first 3 floors, and you're in.
Get first-hand experience with multi-phase cyber attacks by completing real-world exercises from a hacker's perspective.
The only way to vet new hackers is to get them hacking, right?
That's right. In Hack Ops, you're the hacker.
Once again, the path to success is finding an organization with vulnerabilities on their website or internet-facing assets such as web servers.
Explore every corner and every clue to successfully hack your way into this notorious underground crime ring.
Okay, stop what you're doing right now. Restarting the process makes no sense. Once you get to the cookie, you need to get rid of the cookie crumbs. Now get to it.
Along the way, you will become cyber savvy by learning how these attacks happen and, more importantly, how they can be prevented. Score as many points as you can, but tread carefully so you don't blow your cover.
You know, I'm pretty good at sizing people up, finding their weaknesses. Get what I mean?
The twists and turns along the way will lead you to shocking discoveries.
There's always some error or weakness to be found. Am I right?
But for now, keep your eyes on the hack. It's game time. Hack Ops.
So a very different style here, right? One, obviously, we took this from illustrated to using real characters and real people, and we created the entire environments. We layered them into a virtual reality environment, and we had basically put the player in the director's chair, right? But one of the things we also did was we flipped the scenario on its head, right? When we think about most of the cybersecurity training, it's here's something that's going to happen. How do you act, right? But this is actually flipping on the head and teaching someone all about the what someone's doing on the back end and the implications it's going to have on you, right? So it goes a lot deeper, and it helps hopefully prepare someone in a much greater extent to what they need to avoid as an employee in a vulnerable situation. And so we really focus a lot on storytelling and making sure that this is something that people can connect back to later on. So we're going to go from very story-driven examples to more procedural examples, and we'll kind of move over to have Jordan and Steve walk you through the next few.
Hey, Stephen, before we jump into the next part, we do have a question from Sarah. She wants to know exactly what program you used to build that cyber catch example.
Oh, sure. So there are a few things we used. So this was ultimately built in Scenario VR, right? But we rendered out all the environments in the Unreal Engine, and then we videoed all the characters in a green screen studio. So kind of combine those three, if you will.
Thank you.
Okay, let's keep going. Steve, you want to take away, or Jordan?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. So yeah, I wanted to take just a minute and chat with you guys about kind of the science, and kind of the why, like why immersive learning, why do we get better results when we move closer to immersive learning? Why does it matter? So I kind of nerd out on how the brain works, how we perceive reality. So it fully intrigues me why, right? And to be, we won't go too nerdy scientific here, but to dive in a little, there's a direct correlation between the number of senses that I'm utilizing in an experience. So if I'm seeing something versus I'm seeing it and hearing it versus I can touch it, interact with it, the more senses I build upon, I exponentially grow in the level of immersion that I feel. And then when we get into like a fully immersive experience, we're talking about now I have movement and I'm bringing emotions in, right? Now this is a spectrum. Every level of immersion brings a level of value, but I'm going to talk a little bit on the extreme here of fully immersive. And then we can kind of back that into how that applies to any level of immersion brings a higher level of learning, right? So we know that the more immersed you feel in an experience, like even in this example that Stephen just showed, when you start to feel like a part of that story and you're one of those characters in that story, there's a different level of involvement. It brings a different level of your senses and even an emotional response. Bob Bag of Donuts there, it might figure out that I'm actually a mole. And so the more we can bring you towards feeling like you're actually there, the more you learn. And there's some very specific reasons for that. So why does more immersion equal more knowledge retention? Which is obviously retention is what is critical to learning. So one of the simplest descriptions I've been able to come up with is, with truly immersive virtual experiences, it's really where the learner, they ultimately feel like they have a sense of presence, right? And it generates this feeling of I'm actually there, right? And the closer I can get to that feeling, the more I can engage your senses. And there have been hundreds of studies done over the years on what are the most effective ways to train in general, right? And so when we talk about digital and virtual training, we're really trying to get as close to hands-on in-person training as possible, right? Now in the real world, we always want to get you prepared for doing the thing before you actually do the thing, right? Like working a forklift, if you don't know how to work a forklift pretty well before you actually get behind the wheel, it could be dangerous. Or a medical procedure, right? Like we want to get you as much info as we can. But the further away from an immersed experience we have, we're really teaching about preparing to do the real thing. The more immersed the learner feels, they actually feel like they're doing the thing, right? They're there. And again, that science has been done. Now applying that to virtual and digital learning, really what's happening is the more senses and emotions that I'm bringing the learner, that I'm using to bring the learner into that experience, I'm triggering the biochemical mechanisms of the brain, dopamine, right? Like we're actually working with the learning centers of the mind, where in a traditional, book turning page kind of learning scenario, it's hard to engage those levels of, the biomechanical or the biochemical mechanisms of how the mind actually records and remembers information. So that's what we're driving at, right? So the brain is literally wired by these reward centers, and dopamine's the prize. But why? Why does immersive learning do that? Why does it work? Why does the brain respond differently? It's because even if it's a virtual experience, when we feel immersed in that experience, our brain has no choice but to believe that what it is seeing is real, right? It can't risk being wrong. So when there's a certain threshold we pass, and the brain, it doesn't even matter if the graphics look realistic. The brain, when it sees depth and movement, and we talk about 6 degrees of freedom, when I feel like I'm fully immersed, the brain says, okay, I think this is real. And a real easy example of this is for years, when I first introduced people to virtual reality, I loved to use this specific simulation where they put on a headset and they would be suddenly on the side of this beautiful mountain, this huge mountain that's been digitized. It's in Washington State. And you're overlooking this huge, beautiful Vista Valley, right? There's birds flying by. It feels like you're there. It does not look fake. It looks very much real. And you can kind of move yourself up this mountain. I have them work themselves up to the very top. And there's this very top overlook point where you're literally standing on the edge of a cliff. You look down and it's a multi-1,000-foot cliff below you. And just to prove the point of this change that your mind makes when you feel fully immersed and you can no longer convince your brain it's not real, I'd ask them to step off. Now, to tell them to step off of a 3,000-foot cliff obviously would be insane, but they know minutes before, right? They were in our office in Lehigh, Utah, standing on the hardwood floor of our conference room. They know there's no drop in front of them. But without fail, everybody, when you ask them to take one step off that edge, if they'll do it, some people just straight up won't do it. They're like, no, I don't, they nope out is what we call it. Nope. The ones who will actually do it, they all do the same thing. They tiptoe, just barely. They'll tiptoe their foot forward, trying to reinforce to their brain, look, there's not a big gaping chasm in front of me. It's the floor. It's fine. And they'll finally step. And so that's eliciting a response, in the body that's different. And whether it's full immersion or no immersion, there are benefits all along that spectrum, right? Any level of immersion that I can give you brings more of that. And so when we talk about a fully immersive experience, again, is kind of at the extreme here. We work on all levels of immersion as it relates to training. But you're really trying to get to that point where your brain kind of says, I've been there and done that, right? So when it gets to the end of that experience, you don't just feel like you're ready to do the real thing. You feel like you've done it. That's kind of the holy grail of, immersive learning and getting to that next level of training. So, with that, there are a lot of metrics. There's a lot of ROI metrics. Stephen already hit on a few of those. We'll talk about a few more in a minute here. But anytime we can transfer knowledge more quickly and help that user build a mental model because they feel like they're there, that leads to some obvious outcomes, right? Speed, I can learn quicker. Retention goes up. And then if Stephen, if you want to jump to that next slide really quick, I'll talk about just a few metrics here around this. But these metrics are really important because when we talk about an ROI on a training program in general, the higher level of immersion can cost more, but when you look at that return, some of the examples that we'll show you here and some of the results that our clients have had, when you can cut training times in half or better, what is that worth? And even better, retention. So, to go through a few of these specifically. So in some studies, and I've seen multiple studies that show this, all this data, but a few points that I pulled. So when a training, when you give someone a virtual training experience that feels fully immersive, when they come out of that, they feel that it is the most superior way. 95% of the time, they feel it is the most superior way to train. And that's very interesting because, even compared to hands-on training with an expert, sometimes we can layer in pieces that are hard to do in the real world. One of the examples we'll show is an injection training piece where really to be successful at injecting a patient, whether it's, a medicine or a therapeutic of any kind, I need to know what's happening below the skin, right? I need to make sure I'm hitting an artery or missing an artery or missing a nerve. And so to build that 3D model of the anatomy is critical. Well, you can't see through a patient's skin, right? So, but in a simulation, you can. We can let them control how much they can see those landmarks below the skin, the bony landmarks, the arteries and veins, and the nerves, to start to really build that model so that when they come out of that experience, they might actually even have more information than would have been possible in a hands-on training experience. And along those lines, so over 80% of participants, having gone through immersive learning, they feel ready for the real thing. They don't feel ready to try the real thing. They feel ready to do it. As though they've done it. They've already built that model, which is huge. And then this last metric is kind of, it's kind of the biggest metric you could say. It's kind of the only one that matters. We can build the most compelling course. It can be beautiful. It can be, it can test them in certain ways but if they don't remember any of it, it kind of doesn't matter, right? Retention is really the name of the game. So when we talk about more levels of immersive learning, really the why is ultimately retention. And so with an immersive VR training experience, retention rates go north of 75% versus, a more traditional mixed media could be as low as, 20%. That's almost 4 times the retention. So you imagine how much less time might be needed for training, how much less of it And then, all of the benefits of some of that retention is relevant to, can I stay focused, right? And with virtual training and virtual learning, if I've got a workforce that's dispersed across the entire world, I can now give them all a very compelling experience without having to fly them in for a training, or, I can, on their time, when they know they can focus, they can go through the experience. So there's a lot of reasons why, but ultimately retention is through the roof, which is obviously the name of the game. So with that, I'll hand that off to Jordan. We'll look at a few specific examples of kind of what we're talking about here, kind of at that end of like the more fully immersive experience. And we'll be happy to cover any questions at the end if that makes sense.
Yes, thanks, Steve. Yeah, excited to show you the next 3 examples. This first one is one that, and I'll talk over this as this plays, while Stephen plays that. This is a virtual showcase. So imagine this is a virtual experience center, specifically where we work in the medical device diagnostics, the healthcare space. There's always this need for nonlinear training because there's so many things that are being orchestrated at once in an operating room, in the operating theater, in a clinical or laboratory setting. And so to be able to see workflows and how a room may be laid out, how products might work one with another, and then specifically in this case, both the combination of how software and hardware are working, to be able to, again, as Steve has mentioned, build that mental model, right, of how would I set something up. So as you're seeing here, this is really a virtual showcase of products where they can do a little bit of a deep dive. So instead of going through a PDF or scrolling through something on a website, I actually have the ability to interact, to be able to understand, articulation of the device, patient positioning, how they may be laying on the table, how I might articulate, in this case, this breast biopsy stand, and how high it can go up and how low it can drop. That helps me again understand when I approach that, if I'm going to put a patient on that, how low can it go? So being able to really take the time that I need to as a learner to walk through, and then also to come back. Many times these are just great reviews. I may not use a piece of capital equipment every single day, and it might be a 3-week turn time before I use it again. So it's a great way, as I'm going through my cases for the day, to actually go through just a quick review. And so from a clinical education standpoint, this becomes super valuable. Certainly there's this really interesting combination and relationship between a sales rep and a clinician in the medical device and diagnostic space. And so the same tools that are being used to train clinicians are likely and often the same tools that they would use to train themselves. So it's an interesting space. You can see here, not a lot of user interface. It's really kind of choose your own adventure as you go through and really immerse yourself and become familiar with these different types of technologies. Now, some of these you'll actually click in and there may be a video, or there may be, you could quiz them as they're going through this as well. But anyhow, I wanted to show you kind of a nonlinear product showcase for learning. So we'll move on to the next one, which is less of a capital equipment piece. And this one was produced in Scenario VR. And so at Infuse, we did this 360 video at a local hospital here. We have the case set up, and that's actually me posing as a surgeon and our sales rep across the way, because we really wanted to be able to show the benefits of Scenario VR and the mixed media and what we're able to do to be able to create, again, these mental models and what's actually occurring here. One of the things that we really love about CVR is the ability to superimpose content, whether it be 3D animation, which we do a lot of, to be able to call out anatomical landmarks, identification of where the product, the device might be placed, and then also quiz them along the way. So again, literally in this operating theater, a sales rep or a clinician can be onboarded. So here's an example of how we may quiz, seeing this live clinical image from X-ray. how many levels of spine that we're doing here. So the thing that we really liked about that as well is that this particular piece, we'll talk, Stephen will mention some of the statistics with this, but in many cases, this type of training certifies reps so much faster than they ever could be scheduled over the course of a 6 or 12-month onboarding period, to where the rep can actually start making money for the company and for themselves without letting the certification drag on and on and on. And we've seen that so many times. So this has really been an accelerated way to onboard new sales reps, and then a great way as well for helping clinicians understand and visualize technologies in their actual field. So more of a proctoring type presentation demo as well.
Mind if I jump in just real quick there, Jordan, on that note?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, so as Jordan mentioned, we've worked with we have several examples of these surgical, VR techniques. And one of the things that's really interesting is, a lot of times, as Jordan mentioned, we've got these, a sales rep or a clinician who they can't necessarily scrub in and be in the sterile field, right? But they have to be part of so many of these surgical procedures to get certified, right? So their time to train can be 12, 16, 18 months. And so to be able to actually go, and we couldn't show you some of those examples because of, HIPAA patient violations, like we can't show actual patient data that's secure. But we, in these surgeries, we're able to put a camera right at the surgeon's viewpoint and actually record the surgery. And then when these reps or clinicians are actually going through, they're watching an actual procedure from a vantage they never could have had. And then even furthermore, as Jordan mentioned, we can superimpose, there might be a back table nurse that's looking at vitals, like you can see right here in the background, where in the real OR suite theater, they may not even be able to see that screen. And so we're able to bring those to the forefront. And so in some ways, it's not only faster, but it's better. It's one of those examples of where we can actually bring in additional data that you wouldn't have kind of in the traditional sense that they would have done, that would have taken 18 months. And now it's, half that.
Yeah. Something else I'll mention too is that, reps love this, again, to be able to review a case that they haven't had recently. So they're onboarded with this. And then we build a full suite of all these different types of procedures. And again, just an amazing way for them. We could have the scrolling DFU, the directions for use going, and create this, live environment that is a true procedure, but then bring in simulated elements that just make them that much more effective in their education and their learning retention. So again, this is all SCORM compliant. This is enabled for both desktop as well as headset. And reps that put this on, clinicians that put this on, and looking around the room, as you can see, just again are fully immersed, right? I mean, this is about as fully immersive as you're going to find. And it's not 3D, right? I mean, that was live video and then superimposed with 3D rendered animation, PDFs, images, things along those lines. All right, we'll jump into the next one. This next one is really interesting. We love this. We built a series of injection training courses that Steve had mentioned. And it's amazing how this gal on the chair, how realistic she begins to look. Again, your brain begins to turn this on, and it's as if she's a cadaver, or not cadaver, but a real live person sitting here in this chair. Something that's really important is, of course, trajectory, understanding the underlying anatomical landmarks, how much I'm injecting. And so through the controls, we typically use the Quest 2. We also do Vive as well. This is built in Unity. And what we're doing is we're actually capturing all of those metrics, all of that data, and scoring them and helping them go back and be able to do a free play mode and then testing modes as well through all these different learning modalities. But again, just an amazing way, where they are having to learn, okay, procedurally, how do I go about this? Where do I start in the face for this dermal filler, similar to like a Botox where do I place this first? How do I work around this? And how do I avoid causing significant damage as well? That ability to turn on the opacity up and decrease and increase the opacity of the skin has been huge. You can see here kind of how it's semi-transparent, and then you can see the injection points as well. So mental model training, on how to do this. This particular client has just been thrilled. This has been multi-years that we've been developing content for them in 3D. This is quite an investment, of course. It's not just something that you can do overnight, but once you have kind of the framework in place, we're able to replicate a lot of what we're doing and get a ton of different types of training, a lot of different types of injection training out of this type of scene. So anyhow, just another great way, specifically in the healthcare space, where we have seen great strides with VR. We started out 17 years ago just doing a lot of animation, 3D animation of surgical techniques and things like this, and now we've gone to where clinicians and reps are able to do and understand and translate everything from the 2D to the real world of 3D. And there's been no better way than through this virtual reality application. All right, I'll pass it back over to Stephen Baer.
So there are a few things that when we think about all these examples, and we think about our learners, we want to think about what is going to motivate them to stay with your content and actually engage with it, right? So, we bucket them into these 4 different groups: the achievers, the explorers, the socializers, and the fighters. So what does that mean? Under the achiever category, we think about there's people who really just want to master skills. They want to be much better at what they're doing, right? There are explorers who want to solve problems. They want to discover new horizons, and certainly immersive training lends itself quite well to that. The socializers, those are people who want to feel useful to others, or they want to be praised by others for their accomplishments. And then there's the fighters, those who just want to win. They want to be great. They want to be better than anybody else, right? But the reality is that when we think about what we're building on the immersive side, we want to make sure that what the content we're building, whether it's a game, whether it's a virtual reality simulation, whether it's an augmented reality simulation, whether it's a video practice and coaching platform, it takes into account these different motivations for all of our learners, and that's really it's not that difficult to do, but it's a really important thing to have as part of your design strategy. So I encourage you to think about that as you're building out your content. Coming back to the KPIs, right? So we kind of touched upon this, but I want to go on to looking at metrics and identifying where we are successful. Not we, but we as instructional designers and as a community, right? So we come back to the KPIs and we think about, okay, we started the process by thinking about what do we want to achieve, and then you can step back and say, okay, well, what have we been successful at? Is it about retention? Is it about skill development? Is it about being able to apply things? Is it about thinking about the decision process or individual choices or the tendencies that people had? Is it about thinking about the accuracy or the effectiveness? Is it about the performance they did? Ultimately, we want to really be able to look at some of these metrics and be able to say, yes, my KPI was X, Y, and Z, and I can tie that this training was successful. I read this really very disappointing stat maybe a year ago from a study that Learn Upon did, and it said that among instructional designers, not instructional designers, among trainers, I believe it was something like 69% of trainers are not using analytics to determine whether their training is successful. And that was really disheartening to me, because I think to myself, if we're spending all this time as a community building training to hopefully improve the performance of our employees, the only way we know whether it's successful is through analytics. So I think we need to identify what are we trying to accomplish, and we need to figure out how can we best measure that to be able to say, yes, this was a success, or no, this is where there's still a knowledge gap or a performance gap, and we need to address it. So here are some examples of projects that we've done collectively between ELB and Infuse that really hit against this. And this goes back to some of what Steve was talking about earlier, right? But whether it's ultimately about driving better confidence, so making sure that people feel like they can actually do the job once they're on site, or it's about reducing seat time, or related to that, potentially reducing expenses by, in this case, it may be less about time, but more about shifting over to digital solutions versus physical solutions, or it's ultimately the holy grail, increasing revenue or profitability. You want to be able to start your design process and say, what am I trying to achieve? And you want to be able to look at it later and say, all right, based on what I can see through the lens of what my learner did in the learning, what did they accomplish? And hopefully later on, you can say, this training directly related to X, Y, and Z, and I had this type of impact on the business. And to me, if you're able to go from A to B to C, then that's a success. There's a lot that we threw at you here, and hopefully, and I see that there were a bunch of questions in the Q&A. Happy to step back and discuss some of these things. Hopefully, that's a good place to start. And why don't we open up for some questions?
Awesome. Thank you so much, all of you. So we do have some questions. Let's start with this one. And this is and I think any of you could address this. So what are your views on doing VR learning in the metaverse versus with a headset versus just on a desktop screen?
I'll jump in a little bit there. I think, one thing about immersive learning is, Stephen talked about this a little bit, identify like places where this makes sense, right? Like to just completely switch all of your training overnight is a huge task, right? So as far as trying to find specific areas where it could benefit, like targeting like a pilot program to kind of walk into it, because you don't want to build some elaborate virtual reality training just because it's cool, right? Like you want to go into it with some metric, like why, like we worked with a customer there was a very, very much a human element they were having a lot of attrition with their clinicians, and using a virtual experience that, towards full immersion really helped them work through some of the soft skills of not just testing the knowledge of these clinicians, but of the actual capabilities of them applying that knowledge, right? Because it made a big difference with working with the patient. And so when you go back to it, I guess to answer the question more tightly, I think it has a lot to do with what you're trying to accomplish. Having everybody have a headset on is obviously, that could be limiting. You may have 10,000 people that I need to have training, really quick, rapid training. Getting them all a headset's not viable, right? And so I think a lot of times it targets what you're trying to accomplish. But that being said, a lot of the things we've shown you can be both, right? So we have a lot of customers who they may target a headset, but only half of their workforce or their team actually utilize it that way. They just do it on a desktop. So a lot of these modalities can be done in both. So depending on what you're doing, you may not have to choose one or the other, but obviously closer to a headset experience is a deeper level of immersion typically. So hopefully that's a good answer.
Yeah, and if I could just add on to that a little bit too, Steve, one of the things that we're seeing is it's not just desktop versus headset, right? There are now tablets as well, and soon to be a lot of displays that are holographic displays. One that I'd highly recommend that learners look into, or that you all look into, is made by Leia Inc., and it's called the LoomPad. And the LoomPad is unique in that it's an Android tablet to begin with. And so all of the training, learning that you're accustomed to producing and deploying can all be viewed there. But then there's also this holographic display that, when enabled, gives you that VR type experience that we're talking about in a headset, but it's headset less. And what that allows for as well is more collaboration, right? So that I could actually be, sometimes when you're in a VR headset, you're like, okay, turn to the left, Dr. Jones, or look down to the floor or whatever. And we can broadcast that and do workarounds. But having a holographic display tablet is a really unique opportunity to look over the shoulder of someone that's having a VR experience and making that connection in the training while they're having it, and again, creating that mental model. So I think we're going to start to see a lot more of this hybridization of learning, where we build it once in Unity and deploy it across, through the different types of, LMSs or whatever else. But to be able to see that in different hardware applications, I think is really fascinating. And again, the LoomPad 2 made by Leia is one that we're really excited about.
I'll add one more thing to that. As we think about the experience, you want to think about it not just from the learner's perspective, but from the trainer's perspective, right? So, a project that we worked on now about 2 years ago was focused on classroom training for students. But we did this as a multiplayer virtual reality experience where not only were the students working with each other, but that the teacher could facilitate at any time 12 different learners and pan quickly to see what they were doing in the simulation, could over a headset speak to any of them individually and give them feedback, and then had a tally of all their tasks in a relatively easy to read analytics dashboard. So what's really neat is it's about thinking about how do you meet the learner in a way that's going to be immersive, and how do you meet the teacher, the trainer, the facilitator in a way that's going to help those learners along their journey, right?
Thank you, all of you, for that. And then kind of piggybacking on this, in the field of ID, and I think this either Infuse or ELB, we both do custom learning, so anyone can speak to this. Do we see a lot of requests for creating VR and immersive learning? Would you say that the balance is kind of shifting towards more requests for immersive projects, or are we still seeing a lot of more traditional e-learning as well?
I'll start from the ELB side. ELB is an interesting company, right? Because we're building things everywhere from foundational all the way up to way more immersive content. And so there's certainly, with the evolution of ELB over the last few years, there's been more and more requests for immersive solutions. That said, an immersive solution is not always the right solution, right? It's cool, it can be fun, but it may not check off all your needs, right? So we're actually working on a white paper right now that talks about when to use immersive learning and when not to use immersive learning. And if you are going to use immersive learning, what technologies or modalities to maybe hone in on. And so, I'm Steve was kind of geeking out earlier on the science behind it. I similarly kind of have that same mentality and certainly love new technology as well. But I also, I think it's our duty always to kind of identify, is this the right solution? Because ultimately, if it's not going to drive those results, those metrics, I'd rather always say, let's back up and maybe look at another solution instead. So that's at least my take on it. Yeah.
Yeah, Stephen, I would say, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to jump in really quick with, I saw someone in here asked, I think it was Stephanie, asked about how accessible immersive learning is. And it kind of along the lines of what Stephen was just saying there is, there's a few variables, right? Like the landscape is changing for a lot of reasons, right? There's the science, but the technologies of being able to even do immersive learning, like when we're talking about like a VR headset type of an experience, 5 years ago, you were talking about a $3,000 PC and a $1,500 headset and sensors on poles for one learner, right? Well, fast forward to today, and for $400, I can give you that exact same experience because the hardware has become more accessible and more price appropriate, I would say. And so when you're looking at that's like the cost of buying a chair for a new employee, right? That's pretty accessible from a technology standpoint. But to Stephen's point, yes, we're seeing more and more need for immersive learning and more requests. but the traditional learning, you know, or the less immersive learning, if we want to call it that, still has a place. There's plenty of parts of your training program where a fully immersive experience will probably never make sense, right? And so it's more accessible than ever, and it's going to keep getting there. But don't lose sight of like why. Like, don't just do it just like Steven said. Don't do it just because it's cool. Like, it is cool, right? Think it through and make sure you have a good partner when you're doing it, because doing it right makes a big difference.
100%. Yeah. I mean, we still find ourselves doing a ton of 3D animation, right? Where we started out doing a lot of animation and just traditional learning, right? Medical education. And that continues to be a big part of our business. Has there been an uptick? Certainly, right? But it's got to be the right, you know, it's got to be the right fit, right? Again, what are your learning objectives? How are we going to meet those learning objectives? What are the interactive learning, you know, objects look like and things like that? And it's like, okay, does that really translate to a virtual reality immersive experience? Or is that simply, you know, some type of interactive web experience that we do all the time as well?
Great, thank you. And then for those instructional designers who see a need that fits with immersive learning, what are the best ways to upskill themselves to learn how to create this kind of training that we're talking about and make sure that they're not getting left behind as the technology advances? Can you share some recommendations there?
I have a point of view on this. I think that we showed you a bunch of examples, right? And some of them required a suite of technical solutions and products to build them. And some of them could be built right in rapid authoring tools like Scenario VR, right? And I think the example that Jordan showed in the hospital, or the example that's probably the best example, right? That was done, capturing footage and putting it right into CVR. That is not terribly, when I think about Scenario VR as an example, and I think about the training arcade as examples, those are as easy to use as PowerPoint. And I think that, that's where I would start. I would dabble, I would do a trial, free trial of products like those. And, those are ours, but there are others out there. I like ours better. But, there are, products out there that you can, try before you, purchase, and just get your hands dirty and see how it works. In the same way that I would suggest, picking up, probably the same way that you started, using Storyline or Captivate or Lectora. I think you can, just play around with it. And that's probably the best way to do it, in my opinion. Then you can get fancier over time.
And I would just add, just start looking at content that's been created, to start getting a sense for, is what I'm training on applicable in that sense, and just really start to, because it is different, right? Like when you're working with content in an immersive way, like one of the examples I always thought of was super interesting was there was a simulation that we had where you would shoot a bow and an arrow, right? Well, people for a second would be like, well, how do I get an arrow? And we're like, well, reach over your shoulder and grab one. Like, it's a different way of thinking versus choosing arrow and, or choosing my tool or choosing my weapon. It's like, no, like I can work with you more in a way like we would in reality. Pull one out of your back and then like fire it. And so it's a little bit of a different mindset. So I would just say, just get really exposed to different examples of immersive experience and just see where it may or may not apply to what you're doing.
Great, thank you. And then we had one more question in the chat. Stephen, you shared some different examples of KPIs earlier. Is there one that you think is the most useful KPI for trainers to focus on as they're developing?
Well, I talked about the holy grail being about driving, more revenue or more profitability. That's the one that's probably the hardest to tie to the training that we're doing. So if I had to eliminate one, I'd probably start by eliminating that one, right? But then I think that, kind of going back to what Steve was talking about, does someone feel confident and ready to actually apply these learnings on the job day one, right? that's really important, right? It's great that someone can check all the boxes and they can do it, but I think it's important to look at the combination of performance, knowledge, and confidence, right? And I think that it's in fact I think that having that trio is probably more important than it's actually critical instead of just looking at one, because we often talk about, yes, someone can do it here, but then you want to then do a quick follow-up to say, are you confident that you can do that in the real world? And as a trainer, I want to know, not that someone just feels like they were successful in my training, but that they're ready to apply it on the job. So.